Hey everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of our alphabetical taboo busting journey. We're going to talk today about W for weird. Now, we talked about this being in the eye of the beholder, so we're going to leave this episode for you to behold and determine whether it's normal or weird how we talk about this. But I do want to keep one thing very normal today, and it is to invite Sylvia into the show before I move forward. So, Sylvia, welcome as always, weird or not.
Good to see you. And in the spirit of talk about weirdness, happy early Halloween.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm a Halloween fan. I often point out to people that I am like those people in the memes who sees Halloween decorations come into stores and think, oh, there's another thing I can have in my house all year round. Um,
Love
because
that.
because it's my aesthetic. What can I say? I like it. Um,
It's a genre, right?
um, but that is considered weird by many, and it's funny. I was talking about this the other day to just dive into that weirdness from a perspective of home decor, a thing we haven't really talked about before. Even though it's not taboo, I'm going to include it here. Where I was talking to my wife and my brother-in-law, and we were talking about how. A lot of people are really obsessed now with Marie Kondo's, simplification of your surroundings and everything. And I was saying that I feel like I have a very different idea of what I feel is cluttered versus what someone else might.
Mhm.
Where, for example, if I take your the shelves in your background, I don't see those as cluttered. I see those filled with memories, and it's almost like establishing a territory. But some might
Mhm.
disagree, and I feel like that's a really good analogy for what it's like to be weird, because I've been told my entire life that I'm weird, and I've sort of just resigned to saying thank you when people call me weird, or just saying, yeah, I know. And it's funny because when people challenge me on saying, oh, why are you thanking me? Maybe I didn't mean it in a positive way. I'm just like, well, what's the alternative? Being normal? Like, normal's not exciting. Like,
Mm.
how great a compliment would that be? Like, Sylvia, do you know what? We've known each other for quite some time now, and I just got to tell you, damn, you're normal. Like, it's not a good thing. That's not what
You
anyone
know,
wants to hear.
I
Uh,
might start a new line of stationery and greeting cards on that theme. I don't know. More to come on that.
yeah, happy normal birthday. Have a normal wedding.
You're just normal.
Yeah. But I think it's also down to the fact that I feel that the connotation of normal
Hmm.
actually has a lot to do with what I often refer to as the weaponization of weird, where things are talked about as normal in order to make other things seem not just weird, but less than, to
Yeah.
make them seem not as good. And we've seen this from so many different angles. We see the societal standard of normal being, the straight white Christian male, in an office job with a wife and three kids and a white picket fence, the American dream, all these kind of ideas that are normal
Yeah.
for in a lot of people's view. And it's it is something that has been intentionally used and unintentionally, and both of them are equally dangerous, because when it enters into our subconscious that being weird means being different, and being different means being bad, it makes us afraid to stand out as individuals. And you rightly pointed out before starting recording that this, at face value, seems to fly in the face of the idea of authenticity, which, funnily enough, is incredibly trending as a topic, and people cannot stop talking about authenticity. But is it is it then just authenticity within limits?
Yeah, I would love to dig into that. Yet I want to really honor what you said a moment ago about weirdness being weaponized, and being an immigrant myself, like growing up in an area where there was really no one else like me, right, by way of appearance and habits and things like that. Like that was a really difficult concept. And what I learned, growing up in the middle of nowhere, Ohio, was that, right, like weirdness was code for you don't belong.
Hmm.
So, right, and what was interesting was, like, on the surface, for the most part, I was just like everybody else, right? I just wanted to, learn and be a decent student, not go to detention, right? And yet, like, the other kids would find little things to pick out that would be weird, or like, and I think they did that to really point out that, yeah, like, you don't belong here. Now, was that conscious or not? I don't know. But I remember a scenario in which, like, my mother, bless her heart, she packed for me a lunch that was really unconventional one day. We're talking like chicken feet, okay? So, like, imagine your lunchbox, but then like these things sticking out, right? With like, it looks like an animal that's been cut, right, and placed upside down, like in your lunchbox. Now, like, chicken feet is a delicious item for those who like it, right? It's you would get it at dim sum, right? When you go and dine and socialize with other people. So to her, it was like a treat that she packed. Yet imagine, this is the early 90s in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And then, like, right, these kids seeing like these things sticking out of my lunchbox, like literally like this. And I remember going home that day so upset because of the way my mother exposed me, right, to being called weird. Now, fast forward to what, like a couple years ago, I found out that my friend was packing her daughter lunches that were that exotic, and she was cool. Right? So it's like, so this whole idea that, like, weirdness as a weapon, and then this whole idea that it is in the eye of the beholder. Like, I think about the lunch example all the time. Like, now, right, like, there are kids like bringing couscous and also buko like to school, whereas in the early 90s in Ohio, all I wanted was a goddamn turkey sandwich. So no one would say anything. Yet, like, it really took until, like, I think it was college when I learned that that was not per se weird. Yes, it was different and distinct. Yeah, it was these kids who use that as a way to, right, exclude me or the likes, those that are like me, and just, like, yeah, kind of to your point, make me seem less. So before we even get to that authenticity topic, I do want to honor what you said, because it really does happen. And just, for any, anyone who went through the same thing I did, and actually there were plenty of people who grew up with a similar experience of, different ethnic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. What we encounter as weird is now cool, just so you know. we were just ahead of our time.
And I think as well, it's funny because that example, it kind of ties into, in my opinion, where weirdness can get weaponized in a corporate setting as an example.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you take those kids that found your chicken legs so weird, I'm sure some of them ate chicken. So the
Mm-hmm.
weirdness laid just within which part of the animal you were consuming.
That,
So,
or they didn't know that, like, chicken had other parts. I don't know.
which is entirely possible, but if we
It just exists like this.
oh yeah, it comes from the chicken factory, you know.
Mm-hmm.
No, but genuinely, like, maybe those people also think buffaloes have wings until we take them off to eat them while watching basketball or something. Don't know. But
That's a whole conversation in and of
it's a
itself.
whole conversation. And that's just as a side note, if anyone saw the conversation about the EU voting about whether or not vegetarian meat replacements were allowed to be called burgers and sausages, just shows how disconnected we can be from the source of our food, because that's crazy.
Yeah.
They even talked about banning non-dairy butter from being called butter. And I was like, what about peanut butter? That's non-dairy butter that we've called butter. Anyway, completely off topic, or maybe even a weird topic to bring up, but we'll move on from there. But the reason why I wanted to point out the fact that it was such a minuscule difference and that it was really splitting hairs is because when we get into a corporate environment, that's exactly how weirdness gets weaponized. And I've told you the story before about how when I went to a job interview, and well, I've had a few job interviews where I've been called out for dressing a bit weird. And it's funny to me because it's not like I'm showing up in like leather goth getup and like with chains and like zippers all over. Like I'm the only difference is that the person sitting opposite me is in a solid color dress shirt. Mine happens to be patterned. They might be wearing, black suit pants. I might be wearing red. And suddenly that's weird. And I find that really interesting how people find those really minuscule ways to separate us and distance ourselves and actually just literally just before recording, you made a really poignant point about how my interaction with a colleague had really mirrored interactions that you'd had, and you were like, wow, we're a world away, yet there's so much similar. And it's something that I remember us talking about way earlier in the series when we're talking about home. And I think, with that weirdness, it's it often feels like you have to earn the right to be weird. And whether you agree that it should be like that or not, I don't think it should be. I think it ties into my ideas of authenticity. But I definitely felt like the more that I gained credibility and traction in my career, the less people went, oh, that's weird. The more they went, oh, that's really you. That's so you. And the same thing goes with like, I remember the first time I put out corporate punk and creative nerd in my headline on LinkedIn, I got some people being like, call yourself a punk and a nerd? Those are negative things. But now I keep getting like, oh, corporate punk, that's really cool. That's so you. And it's funny. It's like I've earned that right to be weird, or well, to be what would have previously been considered weird, but suddenly it's just so me or so different or so fun. And the tonality of it has completely changed, similar to I guess what would happen if you showed up with your chicken legs in a lunchbox today.
I haven't dared to do that in a corporate environment, but yeah, it goes to, right? It speaks to how deeply rooted some of these things can be, or how it really stays with us, right? Like those comments that I heard as a kid stay with me all these decades, right? So kind of crazy. So I also like the way you started to question this idea of like, where does the line between authenticity and weirdness get drawn? And your story about how earning the right to be weird comes from building that credibility. And I do agree. And there's, a scenario that I like to refer to from earlier in my career where there was a guy, like by all standards in corporate, he would have been like called a little off, right? The way he behaved, like the way he was very jarring with people. I mean, there were just a number of things that, like, some might even say he's a weird guy, yet because he outperformed everybody else, nobody cared. They in fact said, oh yeah, like that's just him. It's just him being him. It's like, I don't know, he just does this kind of weird magic thing and it just happens. Now, what was weird about that was, on the flip side of that, there was somebody who was underperforming and her weirdness was used against her, right? To the point where there were questions about, is she really one of us? Is she ever going to be one of us? Right? Yet it's like we were celebrating the guy who clearly was not one of us, but by his results, nobody gave a shit, right? Like they're just like, oh, he's got a loose cannon. It's okay. Yet, like, right? Again, so here we are using that same equation to judge somebody, but with very different outcomes. So I posit that, like, to your point earlier before we started recording, this whole idea of authenticity is like, yeah, we love authenticity so long as it's convenient and comfortable for us, which again goes against the very definition of what authenticity is. That's conformity, right? That is literally someone saying like, oh yeah, we like you so long as
Yeah.
you act a certain way that is befitting of how the rest of us might want you to act.
Yeah. And another example of someone who's clearly earned his right to be weird, or whether you think he's earned it or not, it doesn't really matter, but he's gotten to a place where he gets away with stuff he wouldn't as an employee, is Elon Musk. Like
I'm glad you said it's him and not someone else I was thinking of.
no, so no, because if you look at Elon Musk, like the dude's basically just a shit poster with $1 billion like budget. You know, he once changed his Twitter profile photo to some anime girl, and people were like, "Oh, Elon's been hacked." And shortly after, he tweeted something like, "Have you guys forgotten I've been weird as hell all along?" And like, but his, for example, his erratic behaviors and everything, like if he was just an employee somewhere, like it would never work, it wouldn't fly. But because he's got loads of money, because he's got a vested interest in, well, slightly controversial, but because he's literally got vested interest in military coups where he can actually mine lithium, and people are kind of like, well, I don't want him in my country mining for lithium. He just kind of gets to be the billionaire shit poster that he is, like just putting out memes, you know, and it's and to me, I feel like that lines up with what you talked about in terms of those two people, where one of them was allowed the privilege, if you will, of maybe even just being a bit unstable.
Mm-hmm.
But and people were like, yeah, okay, you do you. But as soon as that's not no longer in the picture, and similarly, you know, with a lot of you know, I don't want to just keep racking on Elon here. I do want to kind of expand on that. But we've seen so many eccentric, rich people through history who have basically just gotten, I guess, used to being like, yeah, I'm weird, I'm different, but no one tells me otherwise. Like no one tells me not to be. And it's interesting how that, if we add that to your definition earlier, where it's like you can be authentic as long as it's comfortable and within boundaries, and as long as it's like relatively normal, or if you've got money.
Yes. Yeah, or status, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think so. I'm dressing up as Marie Antoinette for Halloween, and like any history buff, I revisited, right, all my history books and references and movies and popular cultural references to the character and life at Versailles and things like that. So, if right, like to your point, if we looked at these, you know, court behaviors and demeanors that were required at Versailles, it's fucking weird. Like if you really think about it, like half those things you're like, what? Like why would anybody do that? But the fact that, right, it's the Sun King saying that, well, you gotta watch me get myself together in the morning, bathe myself, right? And right, the right to dress me goes to the most senior royal. You're like, like to us, it's like, what? And I'm sure the people amongst, right, like the king at Versailles were probably like, huh, weird, but but the guy is the Sun King, so
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
I guess we're gonna go with it. And it became the norm. Right? This is the funny thing. The weird became the norm. Or like that is the expected behavior of a courtier, right? Like at court. Literally, like it's like this is how you show up in front of the king. This is how you not show up in front of the king. When you're on the grounds of Versailles, these are the things you do. These are the things you don't. And look at Marie Antoinette, like later on, right? Like the, you know, she did basically tell most of the courtiers at Versailles that, like, you know, I'm not really into this. And what do they make her? An outcast.
Yep.
Right? So here she's like, we don't do that back in Austria. We don't do that at Schönbrunn. Like, right? But like, this is strange. But then she was the strange one to them. So, right, like, but it's the status. Like, I feel like it is money, right? Elon has status and money. It doesn't matter if he can be the biggest anime nerd. I personally love anime, so I don't see anything weird about it. But like, some people are like, oh, what a nerd. But it's like, well, I guess, you know, he's a billion-dollar playboy, whatever. So, you know, let him be. But like you said, if he was just a regular Joe Schmo living in a random apartment, by Wrigley Field here in Chicago, he would be likely called a weirdo for not going to the baseball games or going out, meeting women, whatever, right? So there is something about that status, and the money, the power, that somehow makes it all okay.
But
and I don't per se agree with that.
And I think as well, if I add another angle in here that relates both to some famous people, but also your example earlier, is that sometimes it's actually not good that this weirdness gets overly accepted. And I'm not saying that as someone who thinks we should judge people for it, but rather sometimes we do need to look at this behavior and ask, where is it actually coming from? And as an example, I've had people in my team in the past at a workplace where people thought, oh, they're just really weird. They act really weird. Turns out the person had some pretty severe mental health problems. This was their way of acting out to try and hide some of that. And I'm really glad that I managed to have a conversation with the person. We managed to talk about it, and the person ended up getting some help, because who knows where they would have gone otherwise, because people, again, I guess out of comfort, it's easier to think that person is weird than maybe I should help them.
I agree, and I love that you brought that up, because just tying in with some of the things you talked about earlier, and that I have been thinking through since, this idea that, right, weirdness can be weaponized. If you really think about it, like, that language is learned at a young age, right? So just going back to the early 90s, like, this whole idea of my food being weird and therefore I'm weird, that was learned behavior, right? That some kid was taught at home, going like, oh, don't eat that weird stuff. Weird in this case, it's a misnomer, right? It's a mislabeling. It's just unfamiliar. So to your point, right, like, we get lazy, or we get taught these lazy behaviors of, like, anything that is not to our understanding, that is not familiar to us, is labeled weird. But that's just lazy language. That's lazy communication. To your point, like, that guy that I mentioned, right, who was a little potentially unstable at work, like, no one suggested even that he might actually need some help, like, from a mental health perspective, right? I don't know what happened to him, but I'm going to guess that he probably fritzed out at some point because of some of the behaviors that he was demonstrating, which did later on lead me to believe, as I thought more about it objectively, that I think he was dealing with some stuff, right? Substance might have been even involved, yet, right, like, weirdness was just widely applied to both him and the other person, who just happened to have a different viewpoint on life. She wasn't unbalanced. She wasn't off her rocker. She just had a different viewpoint about what life is and what life isn't. And that was that. But you're right. Like, there's something interesting about, like, how, the weird gets weirdly applied or, like, universally applied, yet I think it does beckon us, or I think it does deserve a second look in terms of, like, is this truly weird, or are we just uncomfortable with it? Is this truly weird, or is there a problem here? Is this weird, or is this just something that, like, I'm scared of because I had never seen, smelled, heard, or eaten it? Right? And I so love that you pointed that out.
And I think, I don't want to go too nerdy here, but if we look at the etymology around the words that we use for weirdness as well, like, as an example, the food that you brought to school wasn't weird, but to the kids there, it was strange. A lot of people use those two words interchangeably, but they do not mean the same thing. Something strange is something that's foreign to you, something that's unknown.
Yes.
But these sorts of words have historically been very much used as negative terms. If you think about the fact, the word queer used to mean weird, something a bit odd. It was then weaponized against the LGBTQ community, who have now taken it back and added the Q to LGBTQ and fully gone full circle and gone, cool, queerness is cool. And the same thing in like British English, the word batty used to be like, oh, that's a bit weird. And there's a whole like page filled with these in Lord of the Flies, where someone says about one of the kids, like, oh, there was something queer about him, and we thought he was batty, but we now realize he's delightfully gay. And it's like, wow, you've done a bingo. But it's interesting to see how the etymology causes these words to evolve and either become positive, which sadly we find few examples of, but actually it's more common that words over a period of time, especially when it has to do with something like that, becomes again, yeah, weaponized against a specific group of people. And like racial slurs are well, I don't want to call it a treasure trove because that sounds awful, but there's a lot there to unpack when it comes to the way that people have done similar things as we've talked about with weirdness.
You know, this brings to mind sort of this idea of exotic, right? So that became the euphemism for right foreign or strange or unfamiliar. And I actually have a problem with that notion as well, because again, that signals right a number of things. Right, it still signals strangeness, right? That foreignness, that it's excluded, right? Like somebody is excluded, or this is not part of the general zeitgeist, right? And I do have a problem with that kind of majority versus minority stance. Yet I'll say this. So back to the food example, there was a scenario in which my friend asked me proactively to invite her out to dim sum. So as a Hong Konger, like dim sum is like, you know, brunch. It's like eating pancakes, right? Like it's that common to me. Yet a lot of people may not have the knowledge, you know, the know-how, the comfort, right, to enjoy that part of my cultural cuisine. And so this friend of mine asked me if I could take her. I go, of course. Now she then brought a friend, and this is the funny part. So this friend, the whole time, so not my friend but her friend, the whole time was like looking at everything, going like, what is this? What is that? Now she's of French background. So I go, okay, well, let's tie it back to what you know, right? So escargot, tripe, right? All kinds of things, right? And exactly, right? So I go, what if somebody did that to your food? And it was like, I blew her mind. Like, she goes, I never thought of that. I'm like, of course you wouldn't, right?
Yeah.
But like, you're doing exactly that here, right? And like I said, I'm going to invite you to use different language, right? You can say things like, I'm inexperienced, I'm uncomfortable, I'm learning, or I'm attempting to learn. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Yeah. All those are acceptable alternatives to you going like this. Right? Because it's just like, that's just so disrespectful. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with being inexperienced, not knowing what you're doing, being uncomfortable, adventurous, learning, attempting to learn, whatever. Those are all acceptable. But I think that goes back to what you said earlier, in that like most people just go, that's weird, instead of going like, no, I'm the one with the discomfort here. I'm the one feeling out of place. I'm the one feeling not with it. Everybody else in that restaurant, we were just all eating. We were all doing our thing. She was the only one going like, you know, and she didn't see the irony of like, that was actually weird.
Yeah.
But I think there is something about the language. And as soon as I said that, you know, I think it helped her see that, wow, like I really had never thought about this, or I never was taught better. Like she just defaulted, right? Just the autopilot of like anything different. I'm like, I'm going to guarantee that if you were to show up with a plate of escargot to an American house party, you'd probably be laughed out of the house. I mean, wouldn't mean my house because I like it, but like most people are like, ew. But what they're really saying is like, this is uncomfortable. I don't know what this is. I don't know what I'm doing. yet, right, we always project it onto the object or the person with which we're unfamiliar. And that's the pivot that I really want to myself practice more, and also invite others to lean into.
And I think it's a great framework to have, regardless of whether, yeah, it's food, it's people.
Right.
If you don't understand how someone lives their life, rather than being, oh, that's a problem, recognize your own, not necessarily problem, but just inexperience and lack of knowledge, and educate
Mhm.
yourself.
Yeah.
And there's this common misconception from people that no one's willing to answer questions, that everyone will be offended if you ask a question. Nah, man, if you ask an offensive question, hell yeah, people get offended. Like,
Right.
like I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be trans, and he was saying how, like, if people want to ask questions, he's more than happy to. But if the questions suddenly start being very genitalia related, he's like, it doesn't matter whether you're trans or not. That shit doesn't fly. Like, no one asks anyone else about their genitalia. That's the weird bit.
Mm.
And
Right.
yeah, and he was saying, like, there's such a big difference between people that are genuinely looking to, like, educate themselves and actually put some thought and care into the questions, and those who don't.
Yeah.
And similarly with the food, you know, there's a difference between being, what's this disgusting thing that's on my plate, versus, hey, I'm eating this for the first time. Could you tell me a little bit about what these are? Like, how do you eat them? With
Right.
what? Like,
Yes. Right.
otherwise, you're jumping to assumptions that really don't paint you in a good light.
Agreed. Agreed. 100%. And you know, I really love the story you just told about, you know, a friend talking about their experience, right, with being trans. So there's a good friend of mine, and somebody in her family did have a gender reassignment. And so she informed us friends just to be like, hey, FYI, this is something I'm educating myself on. I just want you all to know this is part of my journey. And like, there was kind of this silence in the room. And I could tell people, like, what do we say to that? And I even said, listen, I don't know how to respond to that. I feel the discomfort, not because of the person choosing what they've chosen, but I don't know what's socially acceptable to
Hmm.
ask. I don't know what's okay to inquire. Is it even okay for me to ask questions of you or them? What's kind of like the pathway right
Hmm.
here? And she even said, I don't know everything yet I appreciate you just stating that your discomfort is with your not knowing, right? The inexperience of someone going, hi, my, you know, relative is now trans. Like, that was my first encounter. I don't, you know, but it's like, uh, but yet, like, I'm really glad that we took the time to just openly communicate that. And I think, you know, that it does take a little bit of maturity, and not to say I'm so mature, and which will tie into the next week's topic, but there is something about, like, hey, I recognize in myself where this discomfort is coming from, and to meet the reality, right, as best as I can, versus, like, I think had I not said something, she might have misread my discomfort
Hmm.
of, right, perhaps being something to do with her relative being trans, like that. And that's not even
Yeah,
close, right? So I'm glad that we had that, you know, trusting each other, that kind of, you know, mature open communication. And I do want to encourage that for everybody listening, even if it's somebody that you don't know as well, stating just like, hey, I'm not sure what I'm doing here. So I might be a little, right, awkward at first, or it's just like, I would love some help. Like, to your point, like, I would like to learn what I'm eating here, or what we're talking about. I just don't know it as well to have that comfort and, you know, fluency and fluidity yet. That will, I think, in a lot of cases, help both sides come together, versus like someone going like, well, she acted so weird, right?
yeah,
And then like someone be like, well, you were weird, and then it's just this whole like, let's see who was weirdest, and which helps nobody.
exactly. And I think, you know, showing that vulnerability is never a bad thing. Just like you happily say, oh, actually, I don't know this language.
Mhm.
it's the same. If you don't know the vocabulary, you don't know the area, you don't know it, it's fine to say that. And look, if someone gets offended by a question you didn't think was offensive, a you know controversial opinion maybe, but it's kind of up to them to determine whether it was offensive or not.
Mhm.
So look, if there's one person who you can't talk to about this, there's 100 others that you can. Like, seek out
Mhm.
people that want to talk. But in an effort to wrap this up a little bit and tie into next week, I want to move from one transition to another, and talk about youth. So next week we're going to talk about why for youth, and why we're going to talk about that is quite simple. It may not seem like a taboo topic to many, but it's interesting how we talk about youth in sort of hushed tones at times, because we sort of seem to transition in life from feeling like we're too young to do something to transition over to feeling like we're too old to do something, or like we should have done more when we were young, and suddenly we start feeling old, based often on very arbitrary things.
Mhm.
And this, as so many others, it spans across the workplace and beyond. We can talk about that we can talk about that till we're old, but we'll probably retain some youth till the end of next week's episode at least.
I love the game plan we have, and I look forward to chatting with you about youth next week.